Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Freedom Hub's Working Group. I am your host, Jeff Cantor, along with my co-host, Charles Froman. We are definitely sponsored by the Freedom Hub, and we are absolutely the disruptors intersection, as you shall see. Most importantly, we are recording these for posterity, so you can register if you're not already registered to get regular notices when this show is going to occur again. And all these videos are on these 4 channels, so every weekend they're all posted and they'll all be available, and I'll show you where that sits in a minute here. And then we actually have some other shows, so you can certainly pause this video, and these are all case sensitive, and come and check out whichever one of these channels is your favorite. If you could do us a favor, I would suggest going to each of them that you like and subscribe, because even if you love the one BitChute, go ahead and subscribe to Brighteon on YouTube and Rumble, because the more circulation we get, the more these messages get out. We are hubbing out of the the Marketplace for Health, Wealth, and Freedom, which is MPHWF for short. And that's kind of the easiest way to find it. So let's take a quick detour as we get into today's topic. This is the website itself, and there's an awful lot of stuff to come here and find all about. Just to take a quick dive, the important one is under the Home tab, Webinars. When you click on that, you end up over here. Explains a little bit about what everything's going on. Gives you a breakout on who the current webinars are. So here we are on the one to the left here today at 4. And then there's another one tonight at 7 that's about the medical field. And it's going to be a killer one about the FCC and 5G. It's going to be some very interesting information there. We actually do one about money. And then all the way down here, we also show who's coming up, although these happen to be the last ones for the year. And then here's the important part. At the bottom, here are the links to each of those channels. And to give you a little bit of an idea here, let's jump to a couple of those just so you sort of can see. So this is the same videos. I'm just showing 3 of these areas, but you'll notice there's an awful lot of videos. They go back for years. There's some really fantastic stuff, and sadly the bulk of it still current, because these problems still exist. And so you'll see here, and you can become subscribers of each of these channels, even though it's the same info. Again, we like the idea of having you share as much of this as possible. So then also, very importantly, when the event is over, it's not actually over, because whatever this person is talking about, it probably needs to be dealt with on an ongoing basis. And so here's your chance to continue the conversation and stay engaged. And it takes even a little deeper spin than that, because here we also have the fighting. These are all different tabs underneath some of these various areas here that I'm jumping around to. Here's fighting for freedom as an example. But this is very important. This is all of the advocacy issues that are up before us right now, which is important. And then also an ever-growing list of organizations that are out there trying to preserve freedom in America, which is important. And invariably, we have some great videos at the bottom to tap into. There's other areas to find out about, like he was a good example about your wealth. If I wanted to find out how I can make more happen with that, I have a whole little area here we've presented that breaks into a lot of stuff that you're not going to be cognizant of. And that's part of what this whole idea of the marketplace for all these areas are about, things you did not know about. So into today, we do have a group site up on LinkedIn, so we certainly would love to have you take advantage of coming there too. And let's take a look at how this site works in terms of our guests for today. And this is where Charles is going to kick into gear here.
For sure, Jeff, and welcome, Danny. Danny Sjursen reminds me a bit, and forgive the comparison, Danny, if it's not welcome, but Adam Kokesh, who presented on our weekly Freedom Hub webinar a year ago or so when he was running for the presidency. He, of course, got his activist licks in as an Iraq War veteran and formed a group of Iraq veterans against war. There's a proud tradition of heroes in battle who came home and said that, there was just a bit too much jingoism and imperialism involved with it all, and that we need to rethink our foreign policy. So to that end, Danny can kind of tell us his shtick a bit more than we know him, but he has a couple books that look pretty good. Patriotic Dissent and Ghostwriters in Baghdad. At his site, Skeptical Vet, he's got a visual, I think, of a podcast he did with that famous director Oliver Stone. So I think we'll be curious to hear about that. But I see him writing skepticism about our foreign adventurism at various websites like antiwar.com or Jacob Hornberger's Future Freedom Foundation. And that's another former guest we had that kind of echoes Danny's topic here today about when exactly our imperialism started. That is, when do we cease becoming a limited government republic and becoming a giant empire? Most libertarians have agreed that it happened a century ago with Teddy and our attack on Spain's possessions in Cuba, and then the really violent Philippine put down of their own independence effort. Others make the controversial opinion that Lincoln prevented the South from its independence. But what's really interesting from Danny's thesis is that President Grant had grave regrets about his role in our intervention in Mexico, just south of us in the 1840s. And most of us in school read Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau. And if you recall that fantastic essay, it started with his jailing for refusing to pay Massachusetts poll tax, somehow helping fund that intervention in Mexico, which he opposed. So that's our guest for today, Jeff. And you're muted.
I know that. Sorry about that. Couldn't click there fast enough. All right. Well, that's good. All right, Danny, I'm going to shift the screen over to you. So I'm going to stop the sharing from my end and let you take control.
All right. Well, great. Thanks for having me. I get excited anytime someone invites me to do my kind of old day job of teaching, of history. It informs a lot of what I write, but usually it's people want to talk about the flavor of the moment. I was just on the radio talking about Ethiopia 30 minutes ago, and I love that stuff, but I actually like going back and looking at the primary sources, looking at what actually happened in the backstory. As was mentioned, I was in the Army for almost 18 years, including my time at West Point as a cadet. Developed a bit of a reputation as a dissenter since then. But, before I was even a professional soldier, which I started doing at 17 when my mother signed me in, to the military, I was a professional geek before that. And history was the thing. It always was. My view of it changed over time. When I was a kid, actually, they changed the rule at the New York branch of the Staten Island Library in New York to let me take more than 7 books out, because they realized after a while that I would take 20, but I would really read them and I would always return them. And I would often be kind of manic on a subject. So I would get really obsessed with one thing. One summer I took out every book in the library on Custer, another on Napoleon, I was really into military history. There was a spring break or a fall break or something like that where I took all the Mexican-American War stuff out. And the thing is, I was like 8. I just started reading really early and cared about this. Of course, back then, my focus on a subject like the Mexican-American War was purely military history. That's what I cared about. I wanted to know about the battles. I wanted to know about the heroism. And someday, I hope that I could be that too. And that's how a 17-year-old ends up at West Point or in the Army. So, that kind of is my basic background. But I then, after going off and doing Iraq and Afghanistan, after doing the thing that my generation did, which is graduate, in my case, in 2005, head to Iraq first, despite the fact that it was Afghanistan, if anything, right, that had something to do with 9/11. Most of us went to Iraq. Most of us after that ended up in Afghanistan second. But after my time commanding a company level, about 100 guys in Afghanistan, I was accepted to go back and teach at West Point, which is, I knew that if I stayed in the Army, that's what I would do. And so some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today, interestingly enough, it is really actually from my lecture notes and my discussion notes and some of the seminars I ran for the freshmen, mostly plebe cadets at West Point. And by that point in my career, after being in Iraq and Afghanistan, still on active duty, still on paper, one of their kind of golden boys, but in my heart, I mean, I was against both of those wars. I was beginning to actually dissent from empire in a systemic sense, which I'm going to talk about today. So it's kind of remarkable what I got away with at West Point, because mostly because no one was watching. And I did have a good boss there who was pretty open-minded. But my view of the Mexican-American War had changed. My view of most history had changed. I was looking for different things. I wanted to know about context. I wanted to know about connections. And I wanted to know about legacy. I didn't just want to know about the battles and the trumpets and the banners. So the interesting thing about this topic, it was one of my favorites to teach. I was in a kind of bad place in grad school right before I taught at West Point. I kind of had a little bit of like a collapse, PTSD related. I finally agreed to get into some therapy, but really I was in like an identity crisis and an ethical crisis because I was opposed to what I'd spent my adult life doing. And now I get put in front of the future, right, at the military academy, right, kind of the center of martial training in the United States in many ways. And I was feeling kind of lonely, frankly. I mean, not to play woe is me. I just, I had the sense that most of my brother officers didn't feel the same way as I did, that I couldn't really connect with them. I had always had a whole lot of dead soulmates because my first love, and turns out to be the love of my life, was my books and my reading. But it was bad. It was a tough time. And I started looking at the Mexican-American War again to prep for teaching, you know, especially when I was put in charge of the advanced course that I got to design. And I found these new links to dead soulmates, West Point alum, many of them, who had all served in the Mexican-American War, which I knew. But what I didn't know is how many of them, mostly privately, but not always, had real doubts about this war. It had shaken them. Grant, who of course becomes the lead general of the Civil War and then president, more than anyone. I mean, to the end of his life, he's writing about the Mexican-American War. He's speaking about it. He's saying how it tortured him. And it was the wickedest war that was ever fought by a strong country against a weak country. And he had a terrible time of it. And he said, you know, his only regret is that he didn't have the courage enough to resign over the war. I didn't know that part. And then I got to thinking, why didn't I know that? I was a pretty well-read kid. I was a pretty well-read and a solid student, pretty high in my class at West Point. Never been presented to me, wasn't in anything that had ever been assigned to me. And I thought, I have this delusion, that if there are certain facts that are so profound that if the people just knew, it would change something. And I thought if people just knew that Grant, right, this hero of America and West Point and presidency and all these ways that he's been lauded and the mythology surrounding it, if they knew he was against the war he fought as a lieutenant bravely, that would make a difference. And maybe that is delusion, but that's where I came at it from. The thing about the Mexican-American War is its legacy is real. Its ramifications are real. Regime change wars has become this like very controversial phrase. If you say it too often, say like Tulsi Gabbard, then you must work for Putin, right? It's actually become a really polarizing term. But of course, we know that the United States has long done regime change wars and regime change intelligence operations. So and I think the contemporary polarization of this term is kind of peculiar because if one actually studies the history, right, demonstrably so, regime change wars, regime change operations, of which the Mexican-American War was in fact one of those, it's as American as apple pie. So is empire, which I'll talk about. But one can kind of understand the reluctance to use the term in like the American exceptionalism cult that is the United States today, right? About adulation of soldiers and not really questioning the warfare state. We will question discrete wars, but we're not going to question the system that creates it. That's beginning to change. Organizations like this have been on the right side of that for a long time, but now it's getting some mainstream play, if only a little. The thing is, whatever the weaknesses of the American Republic by that point, whatever the profound weaknesses of the Mexican Republic, the inconvenient truth is that 60 years after the colony's successful rebellion, you know, basically against empire, maybe on behalf of a new empire, but against the British Empire, the United States Republic, flawed though it may have been, invaded a sister republic, right, as flawed as it was. This isn't supposed to happen. This does not fit neatly in the American exceptionalist narrative, so therefore it's generally been changed. So let me quickly share my screen here and kind of take a look at my opening thesis. I'm still influenced just enough by, oops, I got to pull that out. So I'm still influenced by the military to a certain extent. I mean, there's no way to deny that. And in the military, we like to put a thesis sort of up front. And the next time I share, I'll pull that off the side. Bottom line up front, we say, well, what I'm essentially arguing today, beyond the fact that there are interesting anecdotes and there's a lot to learn from this war, is that if you look back at the Mexican-American War and you see it in the context of America's contemporary empire, its contemporary endless wars, you see that this war was in fact more relevant than ever. Okay. And so what we mostly know about it, to the extent that we know anything as a citizenry broadly, it's that painting, right? It's this heroic endeavor, this charge. No one really much questions why we fought this war, but we know that a lot of generals got pretty famous and were heroic, and that this was kind of a coming of age of the Republic. But of course, it was actually the coming of age of the empire. So let me pull out for a second here and basically talk about why I think some of this is in fact so important. Okay. The 1846 invasion of Mexico has to rate as an acute pivot point in this young nation's history. Okay. It's kind of a no turning back moment, I'm going to argue. You've got this self-declared and still self-styled democratic beacon that invades another country, overthrows its regime, conquers a third of it, thinks about taking the whole thing, largely doesn't take it because some of the Democrats who otherwise would have wanted to take it were like, we don't want that many brown people in our country. I mean, it wasn't because of some benevolent reasoning, although there was a significant anti-war movement by that point, which had some influence. Almost no Americans know the slightest thing about this war. They don't even know that it's, one of the highest casualty rates of an American war, mostly from disease, but massive casualty rates. To this day, the highest casualty rate for West Point officers ever, more than World War II and the Civil War in terms of actual percentage of the deaths that were West Pointers, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that. They were the regulars. They were the skeleton crew that kind of took over this military. But what they don't understand is the contours, the causes, the context, or the conclusion of this war. And I think we're worse for it. Like the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which I really believe will go down in history as another pivot point in this country, in our history, in our development. Like that invasion, this was sold to a naive public on demonstrably false pretexts. And the blowback from that realization, okay, along with the mounting casualties, actually coalesces into America's first ever widespread anti-war movement. Now, there was significant military dissent during the Seminole Wars. About 1 in 10 officers resign for one reason or another right after their service in the Seminole War. And there is some significant dissent, mostly regional in the Northeast, against the War of 1812. But this is the first time, and it takes till the end of the war, as it usually does, this is the first time there's a mass national anti-war movement. And I think that that's an important point. So, like I always said at the Academy, it's, I think, quite important that your slides generally be, your slides should generally be the photos or perhaps at best some quotes. And so I try to keep it to that. Now, the reason I show this map is to explain that America has been moving in the direction of empire. That's a key word, for quite some time. There's a lot of debate about this. Scholars have been moving it left for the longest time, for their own reasons, and in some cases based on fact. In fact, many scholars have argued that we're actually kind of an empire before we're even a republic, right? The colonial entity itself is this empire as it relates to the Native Americans. Some of that could be a stretch in terms of linguistics, but the point here is the United States really has 3 phases of empire. We don't start using that word at all until the second phase, which is, as was mentioned in the intro, during the Spanish-American War, and taking the islands, taking the Philippines, the overseas stuff, because that looks like empire to us. When Americans think of empire, they think of the high age of European empire. They think of British school children painting maps red every time Queen Victoria took a new place in Africa or Asia. That's not the only kind of empire. There are other empires. There are land-based territorial empires. The United States was that. We went westward, and you see how it slowly developed. Sometimes the victims were Native American entities, of course, who were fighting one another, but nevertheless never faced such a strong settler colonial enterprise before. And then Mexico. And so sea to shining sea was the requirement of that, was displacement, mass displacement, and in many cases, mass killing of Native Americans and of Mexicans, and outright invasion and conquest. This is just a reality. So phase one of American empire, it maybe exists from the Native American entities before, but it really kicks off in 1846 when California, the whole Southwest, Texas becomes part of the United States. It is the Mexican-American War that gives us from sea to shining sea, literally. Until then, the Missouri River, and then, we go a little further out into Montana and Wyoming, that's the frontier. But it's this that gets us to California. It makes sea to shining sea possible. And so I think this is an important map. I like paintings a lot. When I was teaching at the academy, I would talk about art and why art is kind of like a time capsule. And there's a lot of value in just analyzing a painting. In fact, I used to build entire classes around like 3 paintings, no notes, nothing else on the slides, and we would just tear them apart. And I used to teach my students, I would say, because I like to be a little flip and make them laugh, because you got to hold their attention. They're not sleeping well. You don't want them to sleep in your class. They're being hazed in their off time. I would say, there's always look for the same 3 things in most great Western art, or even just marginal Western art. There's always something going on with the light and dark to show good and evil, progress and backwardness. There's almost always a Christ-like or religious figure, often martyrdom, right? That's true if you watch film, even like Cool Hand Luke or Platoon, but it's true in paintings. And the third thing is there's usually some sort of phallic symbol, and you should keep an eye on that. And that always got to laugh, but it's kind of true. Well, this painting is actually from after the Mexican-American War, but it kind of manifest destiny, pun intended. These paintings show us the view of, especially the Democratic Party, which is the hawkish party then, and largely always, people forget that, right? This is not an anti-war party. What you have is you have the light to the east, and you've got, literally Columbia, right? This kind of like angelic figure who is bringing progress from light into darkness, doing it with technology, right? And that's why there's a telegraph cable hooked around her arms. And that's why you see her literally stringing the telegraph cable to the west. And then there's, of course, there's the trains, there's the more modern agricultural techniques, you got the stagecoach, you got the Conestoga wagon, you got everything that you're supposed to have, even, it's all there. She's also holding a Bible, right? This is important, right? Because this is a mission. It's a messianic mission. Of course, we're a city on a hill from the start. And who's running away? It's sort of the backward Native Americans. Now, of course, this painting really ought to have, it's a little later, it ought to have, another Republic's soldiers dying and retreating, right? The Mexicans, because that actually gives us the southern half of From Sea to Shining Sea. And I mentioned Manifest Destiny. And that really comes from basically a Democratic Party hack paper. John O'Sullivan says, it's the manifest destiny of the United States to overspread the continent allotted by Providence, right? So here's that religious aspect, right? It's a messianic mission, right? For the free development of our yearly multiplying million. So that's the idea. That's 1839. So it's no accident that is 3 years after the Alamo, which I'll talk about, and it is 7 years before the invasion and conquest of northern Mexico. What I'm arguing here too is that it is tied to a long string of American messianic entities with John Winthrop. We're a city on a hill. This language is recycled by Reagan. This is Make America Great Again stuff, but there's nothing new about MAGA. MAGA has been used by politicians since before there was an America. So I think that this is also a rather important point. Okay, so let me back out of here if I can and unshare here for a second. Okay. You'll have to excuse the Luddite factor. So I think I'm back on. That's the painting analysis. That tells us a little bit about what's going on. What I want to make clear here is that the Mexican-American War was not a fait accompli. It didn't have to happen. There was nothing actually predetermined about this. Now, there was a lot of reason to think the United States would probably take this territory. We had the larger population by far. The English colonies had always grown in ways that the Spanish and the French didn't. They were formed for different reasons. The French Empire was more of a fur trading empire. Mostly men were there. Not a lot of families came. The Spanish was as much a missionary. That's why it's all these mission-based colonies and a civilization mission for the Native Americans, but it was different. The settler colonial entity was always the British. And so, yes, there was a force of population, and it was likely this would happen, but it wasn't predetermined. I mean, the 13 colonies started on the coast, and it could have stayed that way. There's nothing that said this had to go the way that it did. But at the time that President Polk is elected, 1844, at the time he's elected, Young Hickory, as he's called, because he's the protege of a patron, Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory. He's an important guy in Congress, but he doesn't cut a particularly striking figure. He surprised everybody. He was a dark horse candidate, but he's a real ideologue. He really believes. And in terms of actually accomplishing what he set to accomplish, what he said he was going to do, he's one of the most successful presidents in American history. If you're just judging it based on that and without any ethics or strategy tied to it. He actually ran not just on, look, we'd like California, look, we'd like to annex Texas, which was very popular. And I'm going to get to that. Texas is an independent republic at this time. But he runs on 54-40 or fight. 54-40 or fight. What is that referring to? Well, we're talking about lines of latitude, the northern boundary of the United States. So, let me share again and show you what I'm talking about here. So 54-40 or fight is about Oregon territory, which really runs almost all the way up to Alaska, which is Russian. The British and the United States are basically disputing what is today Oregon and Washington State. And the Democratic Party in particular and Polk are saying that we're taking it all the way up to basically Alaska. And you can see it on the map, and that's the 54-40 line. And we're going to have the whole of Oregon or none. But what's interesting is we don't fight Oregon, do we? We don't fight the British over Oregon. We actually make a deal. See, the reality is that Britain was a pretty powerful empire. They were white. They had a strong navy. They could produce a strong army overseas if need be. And they could really cut off our trade, and we were very much tied to them. So actually, Young Hickory, for all his talk to get elected, makes a deal, a compromise, and basically gets half. And that's why the border is where it is. However, very quickly, it's clear that he was much more serious about Texas. And he was much more serious about strong arming and, if necessary, fighting, hopefully fighting, the Mexicans to get what he wants. And the Democratic Party seamlessly pivots. They don't say, hey, you promised 54-40 or fight. You're going back on that. You're a flip-flopper. No. The Democratic Party press, like the New York Herald, they immediately pivot and they say, in the wake of the Oregon settlement, quote, we can now thrash Mexico into decency at our leisure. So you start to see how much this had been pre-planned. Okay, so what you see is it was always going to be a deal with the British. It wasn't going to be a war. Polk's not crazy. Okay, the trade is very much tied in. But Texas is the key. Texas and the mythology surrounding Texas is strong in its legacy. The outright lies and fabrications about what really went on down there continue to resonate. If you want to upset people, question the Alamo myth, right? Question what they were fighting for exactly, or complicate it. Remember the Alamo, that rallying cry still rolls off the American tongue with a remarkable fluidity and ease. I mean, the facts as they're told are simple and they're inspiring. I watched every Alamo movie, including the not so great ones, like The Last Command, and the really great ones that are forgotten, like Alec Baldwin in 13 Days to Glory, which was a TV movie. I was obsessed with the Alamo. I had a coonskin cap, in 1989. in my studio apartment, and I would defend my couch against, the enemy. And I was in New York, right? I wasn't in Texas. The story resonates, and why shouldn't it? It contains all the key components of a classic Western morality play: long odds, martyrdom, eventual redemption. The tale is beautifully pure, at least, and the actual context, not so much. Texas history is really taught in the schools down there, more than any other state that I've seen. Almost alone among American states. It's mandatory curriculum in public schools from El Paso to Houston, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The question is what's being taught. And the power of the Texan myth was driven home to me when I was assistant professor at West Point. I found that besides the Civil War, no subject in the entire semester from Jamestown to Obama, that's what I covered in the survey course, garnered more sensitivity and pushback from these normally very deferential cadets, because I'm a major, they want to be me, right? There's a discipline there. They're not as likely to just kind of challenge you, but they start to when you provide an open forum. Nothing got them more fired up than questioning this. What do I mean by questioning it? Well, not just Texans, but the vast majority of Americans are utterly unprepared to read or hear the stark realities of the 1835 to 36 Texas Revolution. That the undoubtedly brave men tactically inside the Alamo died in large part for the right to own slaves. And talk about a twist, to maintain a steady stream of what became illegal immigration into Mexico. This is important. And what's more, the flood of those also illegal American volunteers who jumped into this fight after the Texas Revolution kind of begins, they have a lot in common, these Anglo-Texans, as they were called, mostly from the South, the Deep South, with like the Russian volunteers that we always hear about fighting in Eastern Ukraine. They're not exactly an arm of the American government, but they are kind of in line with the goals of at least one of the major parties in America, which is, in very many cases, the dominant party at the time. They come over and they eventually win their independence. Now, we could debate the ins and outs of that, but let us be clear that one of the main things that they were in fact fighting for, and this is clear if you go back to the press and if you go back to the statements of many of the Texan revolutionaries and their papers, right, their ideological papers, they're very clear about this. I mean, there's a slave uprising that's brutally put down in Texas during this period. Never taught, right? This is never taught in schools. Anyway, in 1845, after 9 years of independence, Mexico never accepts that they lost this war. They never recognize Texas. And according to international law, Texas isn't exactly ripe for the taking. It becomes the 28th state in 1845. It was it was basically an illegal violation of Mexican sovereignty in many cases. And it all but ensured, even if it was right, it all but ensured the outbreak of what became an American aggressive war against its southwestern neighbor. One could argue that because the Mexican-American War sows the seeds for the American Civil War, and since the Texas Revolution and the Alamo sows the seeds for the Mexican-American War, one could say, without being too hyperbolic, that the seeds of the American Civil War are in the Alamo. 25 years, right? Almost exactly 25 years before. This, I think, is in fact rather important. Let me back up there and stop my sharing if I can, which is always a challenge. Okay, let me jump into what actually happens and why it relates. False pretenses and the political ties. President Polk's dreams were big. They were enormous, in fact, from the start. He desired not to take a little bit of Mexico, not just to get Texas, but to make the United States really an Atlantic and a Pacific power. He made a whole lot of fuss about Texas annexation, but his eyes had always been on California. You could read his statements. You could read the statements of other Democratic Party hacks and their papers, and it is clear that the real prize for them was California. And why shouldn't it be? It's a richer place in many ways. It also has a Pacific outlet. And there is no Philippine War. There is no Spanish-American War in the contours it had, unless there's a Mexican-American War, unless we become a Pacific power. This is all very important. Mexico hadn't recognized Texas independence in the first place. It had even made some small incursions north, just not effective for a million reasons. The Mexican Republic had dozens of changes of government in its first years. It was a problematic state in a million ways. The new republic had managed to only establish one small settlement across the river, the Nueces River, which was in fact considered by most to be the boundary, not the Rio Grande. Only one small settlement of Texans at Corpus Christi had actually gone across the river. But no matter, in the border controversy, Polk sensed an opportunity, and he said that the Rio Grande is going to be the border. Really, in the absence of clear evidence, okay? Everything that subsequently unfolded proved one thing pretty unassailably, which is that Polk, for all his aw shucks, viceless personal habits, this guy doesn't drink, he doesn't party, he doesn't do anything. He's a workaholic. But for all that, for all the young hickory, I'm just a country boy stuff, he's a liar. He is a liar. And, well, a lot of American presidents are liars, aren't they, when it comes to war and empire? Polk had been readying the nation for war from the start. He orders a naval flotilla to the Gulf of Mexico. He covertly orders his commodore in the Pacific to seize San Francisco and various other California ports immediately upon the outbreak of a war that he knew was coming. There's a U.S. Army contingent under General Zachary Taylor, future president, to march his small force across the Nueces River to Corpus Christi, which can be seen as a violation of international law. And next, to provide international and diplomatic top cover in a move that's, I think, reminiscent of the George W. Bush era disingenuous deployment of WMD inspectors to Iraq in 2002, Polk sends a Democratic Party hack, of course. Not much has changed in that party, right? To ostensibly negotiate a deal with Mexico. But in reality, Slidell, who was sent, his real mission is to incense the Mexicans with an unacceptable demand or series of unacceptable demands in the hope that they'd appear to start the expected war, giving us, the justification to, take what we wanted. That long-awaited spark comes in April of 1846 when some Mexican cavalrymen crossed the Rio Grande and ambush an intercepting force of U.S. dragoons. 11 are killed. Polk tells his cabinet before this, the same day, hours before he gets the news, because it takes 2 weeks with the technology at the time, he said, the people want war. And they did, a large segments, especially in the West and in the South, also similar today in many cases. We would not be doing our duty, he said. He said he would not be doing his duty if he didn't oblige the people with a war. Hours later, he finds out about what had happened, and he quickly begins immediately writing his war speech, declaration speech. That speech is vintage Polk. It's pure fiction, but it's loaded with some crowd pleasing and martial hyperbole. So what do we hear? Well, he didn't even exactly ask Congress for a constitutionally required war declaration, but rather he asked it to recognize that a state of war was already in existence. This is the twisting of the Constitution that we've begun to see. There's really only been 5 wars declared in American history. We don't even declare war anymore. The twisting had begun earlier, is my argument here. In the process, he omitted any of the complicated context surrounding the Mexican attack, and instead his penultimate line just informs Congress, and this is what resonates, that after reiterated menaces, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, it hadn't, has invaded our territory, it hadn't, and has shed American blood upon American soil. Well, the first part of that is true, it had shed American blood, but whether it was on American soil was in fact rather contested. This was contested soil. This was an effervescent call to nationalism and to arms, but none of it was really true. The territory that the American army was in, simple reason, and most of the international consensus agreed, was probably Mexican, okay? There weren't even really any Texan settlements there besides Corpus Christi. Nevertheless, Polk's Democratic loyalists in Congress, they spring into action immediately. And tell me if this sounds familiar. They immediately, in a cynical masterstroke, attach a preamble to the war declaration bill that authorizes funding for the troops. Why is that brilliant if deplorable and cynical? Well, it's kind of new in American history, although we've done it ever since. Because now, if a skeptical Whig, right, from the opposing party, or from within the Democratic Party, dares to vote against the war with Mexico, he's also voting against the funding of that war, of the soldiers in the war. He could easily be tarnished as anti-soldier. This is where it begins. Now, more flagrantly, tell me if this sounds like, there's this guy, he's been in the news a lot. He's a president-elect, Joe Biden. Tell me if this sounds like him in 2002. The Democratic House leadership limits the debate on the war to 2 hours, 90 minutes of which is taken up by a diligent reading of the many documents that accompanied Polk's war message. So there's 30 minutes of debate. 30 minutes of debate about whether we should invade and conquer large parts of a neighboring country, go to war, kill people, and have Americans die. Only 13 representatives in all of Congress, in all of the House, led by the stalwart 78-year-old former President John Quincy Adams, held out. They're like called the insufferables or the intractables. I forget the term. This is, I think, a rather important point. So if I can, I like quotes and I like paintings. That's what I'm into when it comes to slides. I think that most of the rest is rubbish. I'm not big on, let's show bullet points and all that, but I do like me some of this. So some of it's probably blocked, but the key thing here is, that's John Slidell at the top. He says, we can't get along with the Mexicans, so I'm hoping that they'll turn us down. I'll make sure they do. And then we can give, they're not going to really give in until we've given them a good drubbing. This is a month before the war starts. And then you see Polk saying that war exists, notwithstanding our efforts to avoid it. Methinks the lady doth protest too much, James Polk. But that's what he says. Oh, I've been trying to avoid it. But war exists, and American blood was shed on American soil. But of course, this is ridiculous on a number of levels. And we're going to talk about Lincoln in a bit, but this is a proving ground not just for generals, future generals in the American Army. This is a proving ground for future presidents. You've heard of a lot of them, including presidents of both the Confederate States of America and the Union during the Civil War, because guess who else fought in this war as a brigadier general? Jefferson Davis, who was also a West Point graduate. So both of the future presidents made their name in this war. Lincoln opposes the war when he comes into Congress, knowing that it's going to make sure he's a one-term congressman. And he says that this was a sheerest deception. So now it's 2 years later almost, and he's looking back at the cause. And his first speech that he gives on the floor of the House is to go backwards and basically call out this George W. Bush level deception about an invasion by point. I've just got a small quote there, but it is worth looking at in full. This is Lincoln's first ever speech in the House. Boom, boom, boom. He hits everything that Polk argued about why this war was necessary, and he tears it apart. And it's not all that hard. So the generals, the military angle. I'm not going to describe the war. We don't have time for that. I'd rather take questions. But bottom line is, this is a tough fight, actually. It's a tougher fight than we expected. I mean, Mexico was weaker than us in a million ways, but they put up a heck of a fight in certain cases. And then once their capital is taken, they turn to guerrilla war. And actually, it's pretty bad. And it would have been worse if we didn't make a peace and get the heck out of there, which might be a message to our generals and peace negotiators and incoming administration in Afghanistan, but I don't hold out too much hope for that. But, the generals and the soldiers on the ground were saying, we need to get out of here. We need to make a damn peace because this guerrilla war is heating up and it's only going to get worse. And we are actually empowering the hardliners and the radicals within the Mexican society, because that's what happens when societies fall apart. That's what happens when regimes get changed and governments are toppled and there's a military occupation. Now, what do I want to say, though, about this? Well, you've heard the names of a lot. You've heard the names of a lot of these generals who were there. Robert E. Lee was a captain, big hero during General Winfield Scott, another West Pointer who ran for president and lost. He's a big hero in that campaign. Grant rides side saddle to go get more ammunition or something, and he's rides through fire. Stonewall Jackson makes a name for himself. George McClellan, William Tecumseh Sherman, a guy named George Pickett, who's a lieutenant and a recent West Point grad. He storms the stronghold of Chapultepec, right? It's kind of like a castle outside Mexico City. And he's the lead guy at the high tide of this charge, which of course we know that 17 years later, Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, he's not really involved in it, but his soldiers have this same high tide. And it's General Armistead, right, who gets to the cannons and is killed there. Very fascinating. A lot of names are made there. And then there was a Lieutenant Ulysses S. Grant, who was also a relatively recent West Point grad and, made a name for himself and thought this was a wicked war. He wrote home to his wife from a slaveholding family in Missouri. The family really didn't like him. because he had abolitionist parents, although he wasn't particularly abolitionist, but he wrote letters to her that are worth reading, basically saying that he believes the credible reports. He's seen the atrocities, the massacres, the executions, the torture being used by American soldiers, and that he thinks this is a terribly wicked war. Now, here's the thing about the Mexican-American War here, and I'm going to wrap up. The modern U.S. military, particularly the regular army, is largely forged in Mexico. There's a lot of reasons for that, but this is the first major war where large numbers of soldiers were led by graduates of the U.S. Military Academy, which is relatively new. It's only 44 years old. It's opened in 1802. 16% of U.S. troopers who deployed died there, mostly from disease, highest casualty rate in the American War. 25,000-ish Mexicans died, although Americans historically tend not to care greatly for enemy casualties, and many of those were civilians. The war was this baptism by fire, or crucible for these Civil War generals, but a surprising number vehemently opposed what they viewed as this wicked war. Most of them did it privately, the officer types, but dissent among active soldiers was substantial, shocking even. Everyone always talks about GI resistance in the Vietnam War. Still, the figures of the desertion in the Mexican War, 8% is the highest ever desertion rate in an American war. Hundreds of those deserters did more than desert. They were mostly recent Irish Catholic immigrants, right? The potato famine is really kind of at the same time. There's this big wave coming of Irish Catholic immigrants, and they joined the enemy. So sympathetic were they to the Mexican cause, and perhaps their common Catholic faith, that many fought bravely for Mexico in an entire battalion, the San Patricios or the St. Patrick's Battalion. Most of them die in combat because they know what will happen to them if they are captured, and in fact, many are tried and executed or sentenced to long prison sentences. I mentioned, and this is really my final, but I think very important point, in a time today where it's not that there's not an anti-war movement, but it doesn't have the widespread strength that it did, say, during the Vietnam War and that it did at the end of the Mexican-American War. By 1847, late 1847, and especially by 1848, when the new crop of Whig congressmen come in, including Lincoln, there is a widespread anti-war movement. Yes, it is stronger in the Northeast, but it is strong in the Whig Party in general. And back then, this is the last time this is true, which is part of the reason for the Civil War, there were Southern and Northern components of the Whig Party, and there were Southern and Northern components of the Democratic Party. So generally, the Northerners were against this war, but it wasn't just that. You have Henry David Thoreau, as we mentioned. You have Ralph Waldo Emerson. So you got the artists. And you do have politicians, and not just Lincoln, but you have John Quincy Adams, the only president to then go into Congress and make a career in the House. When he was Secretary of State, he talked about not going abroad, searching for, monsters to destroy. It's the reason that the Quincy Institute, Andrew Bacevich, colleague and friend of mine, is president of. It's the reason it's the Quincy Institute, right? He's against Texas annexation, which you can see in the second quote there. Do you not have enough land? You have taken from the Indians. Now you have to take it from the Mexicans. But here's the thing, and here's the other story that I wish every American knew, and it's kind of how I'll close. I mean, that delusion of mine that if people knew a certain fact, it might shake the way they view a whole lot of other things. Grant's dissent is one. John Quincy Adams, though, he's only one of 14 who vote against the recognition of Mexico. This guy is undaunted. He doesn't give a you-know-what. When the war is pretty much wrapped up, there's a formality of a bill that comes before Congress that all it does is it thanks the generals, it lauds the generals for their service in the war. That's all it did. It's one of those things like when they name a post office, like pretty much everyone votes for it. Not John Quincy Adams. He's an old man. He's 80. He won't support a bill because it's a wicked war. We shouldn't be thanking our generals for this. The last words he says professionally, publicly in Congress, he yells out no during the roll call. And then he suffers a stroke right there at his desk. He essentially dies at his desk and dies 2 days later. He calls for Henry Clay. Who had run for president by this point, I think 3 times. He's like the Hillary Clinton of his era in many ways. He's an insider, and he's, he's always a bridesmaid, right? When it comes to the presidency. Calls for Henry Clay, who was by this point very much opposed to the war. and he dies. The last act of our sixth president is a totally insufferable, some would say petty, but I would argue principled opposition to the Mexican-American War. That he was one of the few who would not give in to this. My point here, and this is interesting, anecdotally, the Mexican-American War not only defined the careers of these generals, some of whom become presidents, but it defines the career of 5 American presidents plus the future president of the Confederate States of America, West Point graduate Jefferson Davis, who also has a lot of skepticism, by the way, publicly about the Mexican-American War. Interesting that. Well, who am I talking about? One former president among the 5, John Quincy Adams. One contemporaneous, of course, James K. Polk. 3 future. Zachary Taylor is the leader of the northern armies in northern Mexico, runs as a Whig and wins in 1848. And then Abraham Lincoln, who makes his original public career in opposition to this war and is in fact a one-term congressman because his district is wildly pro-war. Pretty courageous thing. Whatever you think of Lincoln, that's a pretty good move. That's an interesting move. You don't see that a lot. And then, of course, Grant. It also figures prominently in the career of this, highly qualified by the standards of, what makes you qualified, a perennial politician who never reached the White House despite running 3 times, kind of the old hand along with, some of the other key people of the time like Calhoun and Daniel Webster, Henry Clay. For Adams, the war represented a final service to his country, and I would argue one of his best moments. Many of us have seen the movie Amistad, which exaggerates a little, but plays up his existing abolitionist sentiments at the end of his career. But I'd like to see a movie about this. Polk, the true believer, is at his worst. Taylor, his generalship kind of rapidly propels him to the presidency. Lincoln, his opposition to the war eventually proves the springboard for an illustrious career. Grant is forever tortured by what he deemed an immoral war of aggression. In fact, one of his more famous quotes about this is like 1877 or 1879. It's after the presidency. He's still writing about this, and it's in his very famous memoirs. It even informs, in some extent, people say, or historians say, the flawed peace policy that he had towards the Indians, but in his presidency. But he is thinking about Mexico, and he brings Mexico up when he's crafting policy, which he thinks or says he means to be humane. And as for Clay, it was also kind of his finest hour. And Clay's favorite son dies in Mexico. He's bayoneted to death, in fact, in like a trench line, like in a ravine, actually, a natural trench line. Very, very fascinating. So last point, ramifications and legacy. Some people have heard this quote on the left. The United States will conquer Mexico, but will be as the man who swallowed the arsenic, which brings him down in turn. Mexico will poison us. Well, for the United States, to the extent that countries can be said to have a collective identity, the ill-fated, if ultimately successful, in the short term, crusade in Mexico marked a final end to the Republic's innocence, answering the question of when does America become an imperial entity? When do we start down the road that we've seen come to its logical conclusion today? America was to be a continental power with global potential and pretensions. In the short run, the resultant peace settlement poisons the Republic and contributes mightily to the outbreak of the bloody Civil War that breaks out just 13 short years after the Mexican surrender in 1848. That conflict strips away the hopeful veneer and demonstrated that the real division in America by that point wasn't as much between 2 major political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, but between regions, North and South, slave and free societies. Whatever one thinks of the arguments of the 2 sides, this is true. It shatters the southern wing of the Whigs, and it shatters the northern wing of the Democrats, and you have this Republican Party form, and thus Lincoln becomes president. It's more complicated than that, but that's the general contours. In the war, then, it can be said that America did not strictly fight Mexico, but it fought itself. It fought itself. And, I've developed a relationship with Oliver Stone over the years, and one of my favorite parts of the movie Platoon is when Charlie Sheen's character is leaving and reflecting in his soliloquy. He says of the Vietnam War, he said, I think now looking back, we did not fight the enemy, we fought ourselves, and the enemy was in us. We live with the consequences of empire, of race, of immigration, of so many things to this day. The war in Mexico not only caused or helped to cause an American Civil War, it was an American Civil War, and it was a war for the American soul. And much that has come after, and much of the obscenity that defined my life and brought me to dissent can be traced not just through parallels and allegory, but through fact and policy and precedent, the Mexican War. And that's why I wrote in the write-up to this. And that's why I say, if only more Americans knew that hero, General West Point, President Grant thought it was a wicked war, maybe that could have an effect. With that, I'll take questions. Thank you. I know I'm a little over.
Oh, that was good. No, it was kind of hard to imagine how you're going to foreshorten that. It was very thorough and really helped put a lot of that into context. You know, the key question, and we definitely have a limited time, so we're going to have to definitely try to grab some fast responses if you can.
Of course.
With you know, everybody seems so quick to rationalize everything. I don't want to know a lot about all this kind of stuff. I just want to hear that jingoism of remember the Alamo and off we go. So whoever tries to shape history seems to not have very much of a daunting task to get everyone to buy into their claptrap. What do you do to break that side of reality?
You know, I'm often asked about, you know, what should we do essentially? What action should we take once we dissent? Or once we find out these facts. And I always joke that, well, I'm much better at poking holes than coming up with solutions. I do think this, though, we have to reframe heroism. We have to reframe our mythology, or we have to get rid of the mythology and reframe what it is to be a patriot. You know, and I wrote my recent book, Patriotic Dissent, about this. There are plenty of heroes in the melodrama of the Mexican War. I would like to see more focus to help break what you're describing on folks like John Quincy Adams, on young Lincoln, on even Henry Clay in his more fine hour, in Thoreau, in Emerson, in this anti-war movement, in the courage of certain people, and in the courage of people like Grant, or at least in the turmoil that they had inside their souls. There are plenty of heroes in the Mexican-American War. It just happens to be that they're dissenting against the jingoistic wave. And so I think that unless we can tell, especially young men, right, especially people who want to, be patriots in the traditional sense, and unless we could reframe culturally what patriotism is, then I think we're going to spin our wheels.
Mm-hmm. Very well said. Charles, see your hands up there.
Yes, Jeff, and I agree with Kare's chat comment that this was a great presentation, Danny. Another hero that I don't think you played up much, but John Tyler is someone that Ivan Eland really praised a year ago when he presented on our webinar on his book, Recarving Rushmore. He would say that for libertarians, John Tyler was one of our best presidents. And I think that didn't he suffer because he did oppose intervention in Texas, at least, or was it Mexico that hurt his reelection? So he just didn't even try. And that kind of gave Polk that opening to use that desire to take that land west towards California. Did Tyler kind of heroically martyr himself over this Mexico thing?
Tyler is a kind of a tragic figure in all this. He's problematic in the sense that he kind of pushes through or he starts the wheels on the Texas annexation as kind of a political salvation. But it's not all bad. Tyler is a weird guy because he actually he's hated by the opposition party, but he kind of alienates himself with his own party. It doesn't surprise me in some ways that maybe certain libertarians look to him for a certain degree of consistency, right? Because libertarians tend to anger both parties, and usually for the right reasons. Tyler can't really run because he can't even get the nomination of his own party. He wasn't supposed to be president, of course. He takes over for William Henry Harrison, who dies of pneumonia very soon after his inauguration. He didn't wear a coat or whatever it is. And then he kind of proceeds to run his own path that is outside the party boundaries. And so he pays obviously a price politically in that he can't even run for, another term. And it is that which allows Polk to sweep in, who wasn't the preferred candidate for most Democrats, but so many of the other candidates were like tainted by their insider stuff or something that they had done that was controversial. And so he kind of swoops in and he goes to a dying Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory, who he was the protege of, and gets Jackson's blessing, like at the last minute, and it really propels him in. And for the Republic, it's a tragic thing. So yes, I mean, he pays a cost, and there are ramifications for everyone, for the country.
Sad to see. We've got time for one last good question here. Anybody have one to throw at Dan here? I think you like razzle dazzle everybody with that. Now I can't wait to see the next war or person that we're going to dig into the next time we get you back in here. That was really very fantastic, Dan. And I got to tell you, it is really, like you said, it's great to read all that stuff, but to understand the context of history is so amazing. For me, just to do a little aside, when I was a kid, my parents took me to see the Henry Ford Museum, and they had like every light bulb from the first one to the current one, but every year, one right there lined up. So when you could see the progression so visually, and here we don't know anything, sadly, in this country about most of anything that's going on. It's such a shame. But
Jeff?
yes, go ahead.
If for a last second comment,
Sure.
what do you think, Danny, about Tom Wood's anthology of these war dissenters that you hope get praised as the real heroes that have existed for every intervention? Every intervention in our couple centuries history had heroes stand up and say, wait, pause, think about what you're doing.
Right.
Would you agree with that there are heroes for every intervention?
Absolutely. And I mean, I like in the title, like real dissent, you know. It's always been a minority, usually, with a few exceptions. Towards the end of certain wars, when it becomes cool, people jump on the bandwagon. But usually the anti-imperial dissenters and the anti-war dissenters are in a minority, but they're a vocal one. And then oftentimes after they're dead, they are looked at as heroes, even though they're unpopular in their time, right? So they're later sort of canonized, even though they were ignored. It is true that there is a line, really from the War of 1812 forward, of dissenters, and they tend to come from three places. One, you'd expect certain politicians, right? Rogue types who are willing to take some risks. John Quincy Adams falls into that mold. Then you have some military dissenters. I mean, that always exists. There were military dissenters to the Philippine-American War, to World War I. And then the arts. I mean, writers, eventually other types of art as well. But, you know, just the literary types often do step forward. So to look at some examples of the other, you have Smedley Butler, who dissents mostly after he retires, but is a profound voice in the 1930s that is forgotten for a lot of reasons, because he opposed Roosevelt, because he opposed both parties. And he had been a Marine Corps Major General, won the Medal of Honor twice, very rare thing. And then in the arts, you know, Mark Twain is huge. During the Philippine-American War, he actually says in a column that he wrote that they wouldn't publish right at the time because it was too controversial. He wrote an article where he said that they should, because of what America is doing in the Philippines, and there really were massacres, he said we should replace the stars and stripes with a pirate flag, a black flag with a skull and crossbones, he wrote. And you know, there were politicians, there were businessmen. I mean, even Andrew Carnegie was involved in the Anti-Imperialist Society for, you know, there were other issues with Carnegie, but yeah, so there is a line. It's there. It comes in those three ways. It's informed by religion sometimes. That's the prophetic strain. It's informed by the Constitution. That's the constitutionalist or Republican strain of dissent. Sometimes it's cosmopolitan, which is kind of a mix of both. And sometimes it's purely nationalist. So this is the stuff that's looked at as America first, but or isolationist, but it's actually often mischaracterized. So yes, there's dissent the whole way. And it's very important to rehabilitate that history, because it is often suppressed or ignored.
That's a great place to leave it for the day. So thanks again for being here, Dan.
Glad to do it. Thank you for having me.